Dr. Richard Carrier, I really appreciate your time here. I have another Patreon question. Joseph Rattoni, I hope I'm saying your last name properly. Thank you for supporting here at MythVision and being a patron. Dr. Carrier, his question, why do you think more scholars haven't engaged with or taken your work more serious? Do you really think it's all because of their bias and conflicts of interest? And what do you say to those who say that type of thinking is conspiratorial and egotistical? There's two totally different things there, but
it's true. First of all, there's no single answer to that question, right? So there's scholars react to my work in a variety of different ways. There are actually a few who have actually reacted to it positively. Hector Avalos, for instance, before he died too young recently, was someone who actually found my work convincing. Raphael Lataster is another. And so it's usually younger generation are more open to actually reading the book and actually taking it seriously. Other scholars have told me the same thing. It's like they think that I've got plausible work. But the main reason that you don't see like heavy engagement with it is because that brings down a nightmare of extra work, right? So you have these scholars. Let's take an example of Mark Goodacre. Mark Goodacre is very familiar with my work, and he'd probably be the one person who could do the best rebuttal, like the best pro-historicity book that would take seriously my work. But when you ask him like, are you going to do this? And he's like, no, I've got too many other things going on. Like I've got other things I want to work on. This subject doesn't interest me enough. And it involves getting too much entangled in all of these, you get Twitter wars and troll attacks and, other things. So it's just too much of a burden and too much work. They have other interests. So I think there's a lot of scholars. It's not that they don't take it seriously. It's just that they're not interested in the subject in the way that you would hope that they would be, right? So then you have other scholars who actually write about it and then say completely false things about it, right? Who are actually trying to apologetically destroy it rather than honestly engage with it. Those scholars obviously have a completely different agenda and different reason for doing it. But I think things are changing over time. If you look at the list of scholars, I've got one now on my blog, list of scholars who at least think mythicism is plausible, right? At least plausible, or are agnostics, or are full-on mythicists. But if you include all three categories, the list was about 6 when I published. It's now over 26. So in the past 6-8 years, there's been a shift in opinion. Some of this has been because of my work. Some of it has been independent of my work. People independently coming to similar conclusions. But I think the main reason there hasn't been as much serious discussion of it is the same reason why there's an avoidance of serious discussion of Dennis MacDonald's work. Even you could talk about Mark Goodacre's work on Q. There's a lot of evasion in there, right? So if insofar as they even engage with his critique of Q, they do a terrible job of it. They don't really read what he's written, and they come up with these rebuttals that are easy to refute that he's already refuted in the books that he's written already, right? It's the exact same stuff that happens to me. So the same thing that happens to Goodacre, same thing that happens to Dennis MacDonald and so on, with mimicist criticism and things. But at the same time, you see this growing support for these guys. So Goodacre is not alone now. There's more scholars who are catching on and actually supporting his work. There's more scholars catching on and supporting Dennis MacDonald's work. Mimicist criticism is now becoming hot. It used to be denigrated. Now it's kind of being taken seriously. So it took years, right? But the reasons are various, right? So you can't just say there's one conspiratorial reason to oppose it. The scholars have a variety of reasons to take an interest or not take an interest in things. And I think largely it's, if you're going to really engage with this, it takes a lot of work because you have to actually not only read on the historicity of Jesus, but maybe you want to fact check it. That's a lot of work. Now you look at your budget of your time of what other things would you want to do with those hours. Most scholars have other things they want to do. And I think that's the main reason why the work hasn't spread as much, but you still see this gradual, attraction to it and interest in it. So I think over time, it's going to trace the same pattern that we saw with Thomas Thompson when he said that Moses and the patriarchs didn't exist. And there was a massive explosion, hardcore reactions, attempts to destroy his career and all of that stuff. But within 20 years, it's now the mainstream consensus, right? So I think the question is ask that question again in 20 years after I wrote. So 2034. Yeah. See where we are then. And at the same time, in the meantime, I would encourage people to encourage any scholar that you have a relationship with to take it seriously. Like, yeah, actually just look at it. And to give you an analogy, like I was a hardcore historicist and mocking mythicists back in the day, many years ago, until certain people whose opinions I respected, enough of them started saying to me, you should read Earl Doherty's work, The Jesus Puzzle. It's different from the other stuff that you're making fun of. It looks like it might actually be good, and we're not seeing any scholars engaging with it. You have the qualifications. Could you take it seriously and look at it and actually read it and give it a serious critique? But it took people to encourage me to do this, whose judgment I respected. It's like, well, I guess there must be something to this. It might not be a waste of my time. And so then I did that. And that actually set me on the course that ended flipping me entirely on the subject of the historicity of Jesus. Because when I read Doherty, and I treated it very much like I would treat a dissertation, like if this was a first draft of a dissertation and I was his advisor for a PhD. And so I gave a review of it, including a long section on these are all the things you'd have to change for this to pass as a dissertation. But he was close enough that I think that if he made the corrections list, it would pass as a dissertation. I think he could have achieved a PhD with a dissertation based on this. It just took me actually to get funded to do that work. So I was the one who ended up doing it simply because I was positioned to. I got the PhD, and then I had a postdoc research grant to actually do the work on this. And I think Doherty's just not in position to do that. But he could have done, right? But it took people to convince me as a scholar to take his work seriously and actually read it all through and do a proper critique of it, an honest critique of it. In doing that, then I realized, like, actually, he's kind of got a case. Like, he's not right about everything, but he's kind of got a case. And no one's responding to this. So that led me at that point to be like, well, maybe Jesus didn't exist. I don't know. So sort of a halfway point. And then it took, the postdoc research grant work for me to actually come to the point where I was saying, I'm going to make the most concerted effort to prove that there's a historical Jesus, or really to put this to bed. But every time I looked at any argument for the historicity of Jesus, it fell apart. But that took 6 years, right? 6 years of looking at every thread of every argument and to realize that that it's a weak case for the historicity of Jesus. Whereas you could make a strong case for this particular Doherty thesis, which is the thesis that I defend on the historicity of Jesus. But it took those people to convince me to do it, right? As a scholar, I was just making fun of mythicists and saying that, making the same stupid arguments like consensus and all of that stuff. But I was doing the same thing, right? But it took people to actually convince me to take it seriously and spend the time on it. And so I would encourage people, if you have a good relationship with scholars, ask them to spend serious time on it. And if enough people do that, as in my case, then they might actually do it. And we might get a review that actually is honest for a change, which is not what we've had so far, because we've mostly had Christian apologists pumping out basically dishonest hit pieces on the work rather than taking it seriously the way they should. But again, it's the same treatment that Dennis MacDonald is dealing with, the same treatment that Mark Goodacre has dealt with as well.
I was going to ask you a final point on that question is when we see the trend of people who just assume Moses existed, Abraham existed, all these patriarchs and whatnot existed, they've been working within the bubble of Hebrew Bible studies or Old Testament studies, you name it. And then it's like, hold on, the tidal wave came and they were kind of overwhelmingly forced to kind of really go, well, we're really not even sure now. Like maybe he didn't. That kind of thing.
And what was it? Was it Paula Fredrickson who said on your show, like, death solves everything?
yeah, death solves it all. There's hope where there's death.
There's death, there is hope, which is the idea of the old guard has to die off and the young guard has to come in.
And even Dennis
you do kind of see that. I mean, that was true with Moses and the patriarchs. The younger generation of scholars were more amenable to this than the older generation. And so the older generation basically just had to die off and be replaced by the younger. You're right, with Dennis MacDonald, like you have the younger generation of scholars are really excited by Dennis MacDonald's style work, whereas the older scholars are really denigrating it and insulting it and dismissing it and stuff. And I see the same thing happening. It's the exact same thing we saw happen the last time. And so I see this also with my work too. Like more younger scholars are more like, well, that might be possible. Whereas the older scholars are like, and get all angry about it. So I think that's true. And I think it's also true with Goodacre. You see the same thing happening. It's the younger up-and-coming scholars are doing the exact same thing that Goodacre did, who was a young and up-and-coming scholar when he started this whole trend of combating Q. And he says, I don't think there's a good argument for Q. And then he started doing that. And then now he's a master expert on it. But now there's more and more younger vanguard who are anti-Qiists. So I see that generational thing as a reality, and probably that's what's going to happen with Jesus mythicism as well.
Final little caveat on that question is that, do you think people who work within the field of New Testament studies or Old Testament studies, their assessment of the information can be clouded because they're so saturated in a tradition, a guild of a way of thinking?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Do you see people like we have had Carl Ruck? He's a classicist. He's not a New Testament scholar, but he sees all Mediterranean literature and then goes,
And to be honest,
this looks like the rest
I
of these.
approach it from the same perspective. I was trained in ancient history. So ancient history, ancient literature, ancient religion, and then got into New Testament studies. And yes, there is true that there is a whole guild lore that creates this sort of barrier to progress because people are told things when they apprentice to other professors and stuff. They're told a whole bunch of stuff, but they don't check to see if that stuff is actually true. They just trust that it is. And I see this in Q studies, and Goodacre has seen this in Q studies, where I'll have and have had scholars tell me things about Q theory that are provably false. They're not even remotely true. The idea that Q is just a sayings gospel is no, Q material contains tons of narrative material and narrative sequencing and things like that. So it can't be a sayings gospel. So why are you saying this? And there'll be scholars who will say, well, there's no examples of Luke preferring Matthew's changes to Mark. So what are you talking about? We have a whole catalog of these examples. So there are scholars who are told things and just keep repeating them. They're not doing the work to actually fact check. They're not willing to doubt what they were told, basically. So I do think there is kind of a guild problem there. And it only gets solved when scholars carve time out to actually fact check the things they were told. And I think that when they do that, they find that the things they were told are false. And it's funny that I've seen this with Bart Ehrman happen already in his career in the last 10 years, where he starts adamantly against something like the idea that Christians believe Jesus was God very early on. And then he ends up writing a whole book about, yes, they actually did. And when he talks about it, in the book, you read how did Jesus become God? He does start and kind of admit well, actually, when I started checking, then I found, and then he goes through all the stuff that he found and stuff and changed his mind. And there are many other examples where Bart Ehrman has changed his view as the moment that he actually stopped and took the effort to actually do the research and fact check what he was told when he was being trained as a scholar. When he actually does that, he often ends up on the right side of history. And I think what you have is when people don't have the time to do that, won't make the time to do that, they stick with what they were told, and they don't realize that a lot of the things that they were told are not true.